So the Prime Minister and Chris Whitty both said last week that Britain will suffer another surge of coronavirus. The Prime Minister said that a third wave coming from Europe is inevitable. Is it really inevitable?
Well, I think it's possible that as we start to relax restrictions, cases might go up. I mean, this is one of these things where, you know, as you release controls, then the R number goes up, and of course, as you put controls back on, the R number goes down again. So it may be that we will see a rise in cases, but that now that we have a pretty successful vaccination campaign, that doesn't tell the whole story. And that's where we need to really monitor not just cases, but we also need to see what happens with hospital occupancy and also with the people that are tragically dying from the disease. That those numbers have been going down quite a lot in the last few weeks because of obviously lockdown, but also the success of the vaccination campaign. And if we see those still going down, then hopefully we can have some confidence that we can continue the relaxation campaign through to the summer.
So it doesn't seem inevitable that the third wave in Europe has to come here.
Well, I mean, I hope that we can keep things in check, and we do need to monitor this. Of course, as I said, as we unlock, we will see potentially cases rising. But if we don't see hospital admissions rising shortly after that, then hopefully we can be confident that we can keep the relaxation campaign on schedule. We do need to be careful because, of course, what we don't want is cases to skyrocket. If they do, then there's more of a concern that we could get variants of concern emerging that could jeopardise the vaccination campaign. So it's a case of I suppose I'm cautiously optimistic that we're on track, but of course we do need to monitor it over the next few weeks as we start to relax, and of course send the message out to people that they need to adhere to whatever measures are in place at the time as we do unlock society.
And from tomorrow, our friend, the elder rule of six, is back in each other's gardens. Now, for most people, that means walking through a house, and the people that they're going to need to use the loo inside the house. How can we do have people round in our gardens going through a house needing to use the loo? What should we do to make those two things safe?
Yeah, and I remember this was an issue last summer, of course, that you were allowed in private gardens, but you were allowed to go in and use the bathroom. And I think this is one of these things where if you do obviously spend as short a time as possible indoors, literally, straight to the bathroom, make sure, of course, you wash your hands, take all of these precautions, and of course observe social distancing. That's the key thing. We want to make sure that we keep our distance from other people, particularly the vulnerable. Hopefully it's a short-term measure, and into the future we will be able to, hug our loved ones, but we're not quite there yet. So we just need to make sure that we're really observant to these measures.
In a couple of weeks, non-essential retail will be open. It's reported that it can be open till 10 o'clock, in fact. Now, we aren't allowed in people's homes, and we won't be for some time, but we are allowed to spend a lot of time clothes shopping. It's not, I suspect those shops will be quite busy. So what's the difference between hanging out inside a shop for an hour and having people in your house for an hour? Because one will be able to do it, the other we won't. But they're both household mixing, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do understand the frustration with people that, probably actually for most of us, like myself included, right? To me, actually, I would just love to be able to, see my loved ones, see my family that I don't live with. And I realise that's really important. The difficulty, of course, is it's very hard to regulate what goes on inside a household. And there is evidence that a lot of the transmission occurs within a household environment. Obviously, out in shops, generally, social distancing is observed. You're not getting particularly up close and personal with people that you're shopping with. Shops should be regulating the number of people that go in, and of course, everybody's wearing masks. So all of these things do sort of minimise the risk as much as possible. I think that's the key thing with non-essential shops. We need to make sure that when they do open, they observe sort of capacities, make sure that there's not too many people in the shop at the time, and everyone is abiding by social distancing.
And if they're poorly ventilated, how much should we worry about that? There's some smaller shops, of course, that are, they don't have the air conditioning system and the ventilation system. Should they open their doors at all times, for example?
Yeah, and this is an area I'm afraid I'm not really an expert in, so I can't comment too much on about the sort of the ventilation aspects. I do know, of course, we know that the virus transmits better indoors in poorly ventilated environments. So obviously, trying to make sure there's as much airflow as possible through these shops will help to minimise risk. But the key thing for me is making sure that there's a capacity of people that are allowed into a shop at any one time, so that we don't end up with people in very close proximity to one another.
So maximum numbers in non-essential retail when it's open, that's essential for you.
I think that's what has to be the case. We need to remember that we are still, the 2 meter distancing is still a rule. And in order to make sure that that is adhered to, we've got to make sure that numbers that are in a shop at any one time are regulated.
That's clear. Now, the Prime Minister said at the time of the roadmap that it is a one-way road to freedom. Can anyone say with total confidence that in 80 odd days, no legal limits on social contacts, no limits on the number of people at weddings, nightclubs open, 80 odd days? Is it a certain one-way road to freedom, this?
I think no one would ever say it's 100% certain. There are so many uncertainties, particularly the situation on mainland Europe with a rise in cases and, of course, variants of concern circulating with a higher prevalence than here. So there are those concerns. I think the key thing for me is if it needs to be a one-way route to freedom, which I can totally understand people want it to be, there has to be some slack in the system so that if we do start to see a surge, then perhaps we hit the brakes a little bit and take a little bit longer to get back to normality. But I think the public do need that sense of, being allowed to get back to normality, because we've had such a horrendous last 12 months. And I think I think there needs to be expectations that what we don't want is to go into another severe lockdown, and the way to avoid that is to take it very slowly. And if we do see that there is a resurgence, then, as I say, hit the brakes for a little bit.
So don't sort of proceed with the May the 17th stage of unlock by, or, monitor each stage as it comes and don't necessarily stick to those dates.
I mean, my sense at the moment is there's no reason why we shouldn't stick to those dates. And I think that's the key thing. At the moment, things are moving very much in the right direction. So I don't see any reason for me to say we shouldn't stick to those dates right now. But of course, we know what's happened in the last year. We know that things have occurred that have meant that we've had to go into other lockdowns, or we've had to delay things, and all of these sorts of things, and we need to be aware of that. So no one can 100% say these dates are definitely going to be stuck to. At the moment, I would say it's feasible that we could meet this roadmap, but we need to allow for that flexibility if something that we don't expect crops up that means that it needs to be delayed a little bit.
Okay. The fall in infection rates in the UK is certainly not uniform. There's quite a lot of divergence in different parts of the country. That must worry you. Are there areas of the UK where the infection rate is high that worry you?
I mean, unfortunately, this is always the case. We do need to remember we're not dealing really with just one epidemic in the UK. We're dealing with an epidemic that is circulating in different ways in different parts of the country. And we've had this throughout the last 12 months that the south was slightly ahead of the north, and then the north was having a higher level of prevalence than the south, which is why we were having these higher restrictions in the north of England. So I think we do need to be responsive to this. And if we do see, say, variants of concern emerging in a particular area, we need to make sure we're reactive with rapid surge testing and so forth. I think as we get through this, we do need to be responsive to these little resurgences that may occur. At the moment, across the country, there's slight differences in the R rate from region to region, but they are all just below one, or sort of on the cusp of one. Obviously, as we unlock, we'll get more of a sense of where we are from region to region. The key thing for me, actually, is the vaccination campaign. We need to make sure that we get really good coverage across the country of the vaccination campaign, so that as we do unlock, we can make sure that these rates stay low.
We all want to go on holiday, of course. You're sceptical about whether that may be possible. Should we be helping our European neighbours with the vaccine rollout?
Oh, that's a big question. I think this was more political than epidemiological. I think. I mean, I've always said that obviously the key is not just our vaccination campaign, which is going incredibly well, actually. But if we want to get back to freedom internationally, of course, that relies on other countries also doing very well with their vaccination campaigns. So we are in a position that actually domestically, we could be in a very good place come the summer and have domestic freedom. I think internationally is much more challenging. I think if it comes to the summer, and I totally understand the travel industry want to reopen, it's been again a really rotten 12 months for them. I think the government are clearly going to have to look at this, and we're going to have potentially, assuming rates are low enough for it to happen, really good testing regimes at airports, making sure that people adhere to isolation when they come back from holiday, as it were. And it may be that we need to look at countries on a case-by-case basis in terms of travel. I think it's going to be the big issue, actually, over the next few months as to what's going to happen internationally in the summer.
And of course, we can't go on holiday at the moment, but let's just explore that difference in different countries. And I spoke to Professor Tim Spector on Friday on Times Radio, and he was making this point. Of course, France and Italy are really high at the moment. They have really high infection rates, and so it wouldn't be safe to go there. But he pointed out that Spain is pretty much has the same infection rates as us. So why wouldn't we be able to go to Spain, if not a country which has a 10 times the infection rate as the UK?
Yeah, and we were sort of in this position last summer, that we were looking at countries and deciding, well, okay, these countries are safe to go to and these two are not. I think the hesitance at the moment probably is to do with the vaccination campaign and variants of concern. We have very low rates of like the South African variant in the country at the moment, which we know the vaccinations are much less effective against. And that's a real concern that in the longer term, we will have vaccines tweaked to combat these new variants, but we're not there yet. So there is a worry that if we relax too rapidly, then we may undo our vaccination campaign. But I totally agree that it may be, in order to allow the travel sector to have some level of recovery, we may need to look at countries on an individual basis and assess risk when it comes to that decision as to whether we're going to allow travel or not.
And last year, of course, we had that figure, gosh, we could only dream of it now, 20 per 100,000. 20 cases per 100,000 was the figure when we said, actually, you need to self-isolate if you go to that country. You should really go. The travel corridors were scrapped at 20 per 100,000. Is 20 per 100,000, as we approach this summer, is that still a useful number?
Well, I think it's hard to really focus on one particular value for one metric. I think there's a number of things we need to look at, not just the case rates. I think we also need to think about, say, the vaccination rates, and we also need to think, sorry, I'm sounding like a broken record, but we also need to think about the prevalence of these variants of concern. In the longer term, we probably are going to have to go into a situation when we have repeat vaccination campaigns for the vulnerable to deal with whatever is circulating at the time. But at the moment, that's to me one of the big measures we also need to look at. What we want to avoid is these variants with this worrying mutation coming in and making our vaccination campaign much less effective.
Just on those variants that they're quite prevalent in France, why aren't they prevalent in all European countries? If we're worried about them coming here, when we obviously have a border, a sea border, then A does not equal B, if you know what I mean. It's not axiomatic, is it, that if it's in one country in Europe, it comes to another, because it's not spread throughout Europe?
No, I mean, absolutely not yet. I mean, certainly we're not aware of this. I mean, it's very dependent, of course, upon how good we are identifying these. And not every country has the same capacity to identify these variants, which we need to bear in mind. It's probably likely that these new variants may spread more across continental Europe over the coming months, but right now it doesn't appear to be homogeneous across the continent. But again, it's something we do need to monitor, because it's possibly likely that it may spread further over the coming weeks.